Safety Project Camelot, and I'm here with Maria Wheatley, and we're going to get a short interview here. This has been a very active conference, jam-packed every moment, and we haven't had a lot of time. I wasn't able to sit in on her presentation, and I know that I got at the very tail end, and so I know she talked about water, and she seems to have quite a background in ley lines, etc., and I think it's very important information. So I wanted to try to catch you here. So if you could give us your background and how you got into this area.
Yeah, sure. I got into dowsing and water divining from a very young age because my late father was considered one of the UK's Master Dowsers, and he inherited a lot of papers from other Master Dowsers, and over the past, I suppose, 25 years or more now, we've been looking into the design canons of ancient sites and specialising on ley lines and how they flow through the ritual landscape. So my understanding of ancient sites is looking through the energy patterns. Why is Avebury set where it is? Why is Stonehenge located where it is? And we look to those patterns, to the geological influences, and literally what is embedded in the ground there. And sometimes, like I mentioned in my presentation, it is a particular type of water, which I'll touch on in a moment. And when ancient standing stones are literally plugged into grids or plugged into ley lines or plugged into an energy system, they begin to transmit in a particular manner. And it's very exciting how they transmit, because just like we have 7 chakras, and I know you spoke about, your Kundalini awakening at the conference, standing stones have 7 energy points. 2 are below the ground and 5 are above, and they too transmit and awaken energy points within the stones, and they transmit in a wireless network, and they can transmit for mile after mile across the ceremonial landscape. And with a chap called Rodney Hale, I proved with his help that these energy points that are dowsable, in fact some people could pick them up on their hands, and I'm sure that you could feel the energies coming out of the stones with your hands carrying. And what Rodney did, he rigged up some equipment to see if he could record the energy points. And what he did, he found that they were actually transmitting electromagnetic energy at 18 hertz in frequency. Now you hear at 20. What if our ancient ancestors could literally hear that just that bit better at 18 hertz and literally heard the sounds the stones were being emitting? And these sounds, imagine them like kind of straight laser beams going from one stone to the next, to the next, to the next. So inside of a stone circle you have all of the stones pushing out these energy beams and communicating to one another. And then one particular band on these kind of 7 levels of energy, if you like, going up a stone, one of the higher bands transmits to the next stone circle, 18 hertz frequency. So really the whole of the ancient landscape is not separated, it's connected.
Right, very, very interesting. Well, in terms of your work, have you gone around only to England, or have you gone around the world?
I've gone to many places around the world. I mean, from the age of about 13 to 16, I was actually living in America, in Pennsylvania, in a place called Valley Forge. So I spent some time in America, and my late father fell in love with Serpent Mound, Cahokia, and Newark, and these kind of power places in America. Because America has some of the largest ancient sites in the world. I mean, Newark is the largest henge in the world. Yeah, it's twice the size of Avebury Henge. It was phenomenal. And Serpent Mound is unique in its own respect as well. So I've dowsed in America, I've dowsed in Brittany, France, Turkey, Italy, Sicily, Malta. So I've kind of dowsed quite a few places in Europe, and they all seem to have similar design canons. And by design canon I mean the earth energies upon which they're sited. One pattern that prevails throughout the ancient world is a spiral pattern. It's called a geospiral, and any water diviner that is professional would recognize that this spiral pattern is quite unique, and it makes a dowsing rod react really strongly. So if I was holding 2 rods like this, they go bang cross like that. They're really picking up on the energy. And it's an electromagnetic field, and it's the surface pattern of a particular type of underground water, because geologists tell us, rightly so, that when it rains, and don't we know it in the UK, when it rains, the rain falls and it fills up the underground streams and the aquifers, and that's right, of course it is. But water diviners down the centuries have seen another type of water, and that's a type of water that is born independently of rainfall within the womb of Gaia, within the planetary body, and where this water gradually makes its way to the surface and breaks forth in a spring. That's your holy medicinal spring. Where that water was bored in antiquity, that became a holy well. They were differentiating between the two types of water. So the spiral pattern is the harmonic surface pattern of a yin aquifer, earth water, where you have a kind of energy pattern of like 3 lines going like this through the earth. That's yang water. And the yin water is quite alkali, it's good for us, and water diviners have been saying this for centuries, and that's how I've been brought up to think about water. And it's amazing because just recently there's an American doctor called Dr. Gerald Pollack, who's just written a book, The Fourth Phase of Water, and he says, where water is under high pressure, and it's forced at the fissure systems like that, it changes its structure and it becomes H3O2, and that's his understanding of water. And for a water diviner like myself that's been looking at ancient sites, because we think that the spiral pattern is equally as important as the underground water, because that emits an energy field, and that's what creates the bands and the chakra systems in the stones. It's pulling up from the ground through its silicon structure, because my dad had a fantastic word for these mighty stones of Avebury and Stonehenge. He called them macrochips, because there isn't a difference on the inside of a standing stone to a semiconductor made in Silicon Valley. They're very, very similar, so they can receive information and they can transmit it. So that's how I look at water, and the ancients were definitely looking for these spiral patterns in the landscape, and they were plugging their ancient sites into these types of aquifers.
Absolutely wonderful. Are you familiar with Michael Tellinger's work at Adam's Calendar?
Yes, I was the guide for Michael Tellinger around Stonehenge and Avebury for Megalithomania. So I've met Michael, and he has what is groundbreaking about his work is his dating system, because I think he's done the ancient world justice and our ancestors by pressing a timeline much further back, rather than saying everything happened in 2500 BC globally and all for death rights as well. So yeah, I think his work is phenomenal and timely.
Okay. And are you familiar with Hugh Newman as well? If you've been involved in Megalithomania, I think he's a dowser.
Yes, I know Hugh.
Yeah. So in terms of, I don't know if you know about my interview with Pere Vila, who we did the interview in the Barcelona area. Have you seen that interview?
Was he talking about water and how he felt that water was being manipulated?
Yes.
But yes, I did hear that interview.
Yeah, he's written a book about it, actually. It's not translated at the moment, as far as I know, into English. I actually have a copy, but it needs translation. But he also looked at the Templars and how they knew the secrets of water, and probably a lot of what you're talking about. And then they manipulated in cities and where people are living, poor people living on groundwater areas and places where ley lines cross that are not healthy versus ones that are healthy. Now, on the panel yesterday, a man asked you about his house where he had crossing lines that were not in a healthy way, and you were saying that you could help him reverse that. And I think that people listening to that would find those techniques valuable. So is there a way you could sort of talk about the techniques that you would use to sort of rectify or balance out groundwater that is not really healthy in certain places. And it seems like quite a big job, let me say that. But go right ahead if you...
Yeah, commonly the whole collective word to describe negative energies is geopathic stress. Yeah, that's what it's called over here. And geopathic stress has been studied in depth in Germany. In fact, there was a recent study about 1997 that is, where they looked into over 8,000 people and how the body reacts to geopathic stress, and it was found that a third of all hospital admissions during the period from 97 to I think it was about 99 or 2000, a third were down to geopathic stress. So that makes us quite a healthy population, because if you take a third of the people out of the hospital, then you have a good community. Now, the study also involved looking at underground water and how that influences the physical body. Now, what yang water does, that's the water that falls from the sky, emits a toxic field. It's quite high hertz, so it interferes with your electromagnetic auric field, basically. So that's what it does, and gradually over time, with long-term exposure, it will deplete the immune system. So that's negative. But we can easily remedy this. In fact, there's loads of gadgets on the market. You could spend a fortune buying geopathic stress diffusers and all sorts, but one of the time-honoured traditional ways is easy and it's free. So a lot of dowsing societies don't promote it at the moment because it's so free and easy to do. Take 2 strips of copper, say about 1 metre in length. Entwine the copper like you would plait hair. You're crisscrossing that over, and you create a circle probably about this big. It's called a Lukowski coil, so people can look that up on the internet. It's easy to do, it's easy to make, and then you just put that in a basement, if you have a basement, or in a loft. It's up to you where you put it. And that copper starts to take the kind of geopathic stress energy and neutralize it to a certain degree. That is easy to do, and that will help. It probably won't take away all of the geopathic stress, but you'll minimize your effects to it. So I always recommend a Lukowski coil. And then you can go a bit more in depth with it by using colors and harmonizing an area. So what I would do is I'd recommend the Lukowski coil and then look at which colors would harmonize that area. I mean, we mentioned ley lines, for example, earlier. That's a very kind of generic term, because ley lines come in ley systems. And so imagine that you've got a long straight energy line. What is found in the UK is that more often than not, associated intimately with that ley line, you have 2 currents of energy entwining it, making a kind of caduceus symbol, yeah? One energy is ying and one energy is yang. In ancient China they were called Long Mei, the dragon's breath, the power in the land. And Hamish Mill and Paul Broadhurst, 2 dowsers that I was fortunate to douse with, discovered in 1988 the Avebury system of yin and yang energies, Mary and Michael. You may be familiar with those. Hugh Newman talks about them quite a bit. And that's a Christianized system of ancient pagan sites, because what Hamish discovered was every kind of 10 kilometres or so on the Mary line there was a church dedicated to Mary Magdalene or the Virgin Mary. So we can look at kind of ley lines as energy systems. That's one type of ley line with currents entwining it. Then you have different ley systems, and I'm sure there is one in Serpent Mound, linking Serpent Mound to Newark in America, and that's where you have planetary systems, and that was what I was discussing at my presentation. The ancients looked to particular points in time, for example 2700 BC. Doesn't mean the ancient sites were built then. I'm more into Tellinger's way of thinking about ancient sites. They were certainly became active then. And so if we imagine that Stonehenge, Avebury and other sites are all in a straight line, crossing mile after mile of this landscape, then they also represent a planet. For example, Stonehenge represents the planet Saturn. Now imagine all of these ancient sites mirroring where they were in heaven at a particular time. That's a planetary ley system, that whenever those planets become in alignment, matching what they were on the ground, they become active. So you can get ley systems like that. a massive European lay system is in Geneva. It's focused in Geneva, and it radiates 24 lines representing, the hours of the day. Like a clock, if you will, and that's where all the important decisions are taken on that lay network. They're utilised in that way as well, and it is no mistake that the CERN particle accelerator is on that system as well. So they're used, throughout history. There's ancient sites on them, and you can get modern day sites like CERN particle accelerator on them as well. So I think we need to kind of broaden our awareness of what ley lines are. They can be ley systems, they can be mirrored in the skies by planetary association, and they can dip in the ground as well, and where they go into the ground they form nodal points, really strong energy points.
So have you looked at the water, for example, in Glastonbury? There's a I forget what it's called. I think it's a spring in Glastonbury, in the town of Glastonbury. Have you looked at that at all?
Yeah, in Glastonbury you have the world famous Chalice Well.
Yes.
That's called the Red Waters because it's rich in iron content, and wherever it flows has this beautiful red hue, and anyone that's been to Glastonbury is probably nodding away and go, yeah, Maria, I can remember that. That's rich in iron. And just across the road you have another type of water called the White Spring, and that's rich in calcium. So you've got two different types of aquifers, and I am convinced that the White Spring, which is right close to Glastonbury Tor, is on a very, very deep aquifer, although local researchers say that isn't so, and they think it's Jurassic water, and that it's not kind of yin water, and that there's no such thing as yin water. That's what local researchers would say, but I'm convinced that it has 7 areas cut out on it on the Tor that reflect the energy pattern in the ground, so I'm convinced it's a yin aquifer.
Oh, fascinating. All right, so in terms of I mean, I don't know where your research goes. Do you go into how these various sort of nodal points as well as these ley systems are utilized? I see you reference, for example, Geneva, and the idea that they make decisions, and the idea in theory is that those decisions would have quite a bit of power if they're going out in 24 directions from there, in sort of a radius, right? So that's rather powerful, right?
Exactly, Carrie, you've just hit the nail on the head. Yeah, you've described perfectly what they're utilised for. They have a key point, where the energies kind of go into the ground, and then any straight line conducts energy really fast, so the ley lines can literally transmit energy very fast across the ground. I mean, you're talking like in a few seconds, not like travelling in a linear way, it's bar boom. So you could put a thought into that, you could put an intent into that, and that's one way that they're used. And it's a very sad fact that here in the UK, during the Victorian kind of renaissance of engineering period, there are orphanages and some of our prisons, like Wormwood Scrubs, were literally plugged into a global grid system. It's often coined the 6th global grid system, and it was discovered by a physicist, not by a dowser, so you can't blame Woo Woo Kingdom for that. The buildings are literally put on those energy lines, and they can make you even more paranoid, even more worried, even more violent. So certainly powers that be are using these grid systems and ley line systems for their own agendas.
Okay. In terms of what you're doing with your work at this point, what is your objective? I mean, where do you take all of this for yourself?
That's a very good question. For me, I look at all these ancient patterns, ley lines, geospirals, and ley systems, and I look at them and think, well, how did the ancients use them? You mentioned the research of somebody into the Knights Templar, for example. Well, the Knights Templar used the crossing point of another particular grid called the 3rd Global Grid System. Now, wherever these 2 grid lines cross is renowned to have the pulpit in a church placed upon, and the pulpit is the place where the vicar or the priest talks from. It's all about communication, for example, and that's why in ancient times in Templar churches used to have what's called a rood screen, that's R-O-O-D, but literally you couldn't see what the priest was doing. There was this massive screen came down, he was on the pulpit, he would kind of tune in to the communication powers of the pulpit, but really it was the global grid system, and then he'd communicate what he felt through to the congregation. That was the so-called Word of God. They didn't actually read the Bible originally in the very old medieval churches. So it has communication abilities to expand that. My vision is, well, what if we have our hospitals that are newly built, for example, you divide the earth and you place areas that deal with autism, communication problems, stammers, and you place a unit on that grid system, just like the Knights Templar placed their pulpits. So I see a really positive way forward for us to live in harmony with the earth by utilising global grid systems, utilising earth energies. And a chap from America got in touch with me after I spoke on a radio show over there, and he said, I'm so inspired about this geospiral phenomenon that we're building a place in LA, it's a Buddhist temple, and we're going to look for that ancient design canon and build our temple upon it.
In terms of what you looked at, Stonehenge is interesting to me because I know they're doing all sorts of construction. I heard that they found a mummy underneath it, and you mentioned off camera that they actually found some long-head skulls there. So could you tell us about that, about your investigations into Stonehenge, what is really going on there from your perspective?
Yeah, sure. Stonehenge is an iconic British temple space. It really is. It's a power place, and it's one of the most powerful places in the United Kingdom. Recently there was a series of archaeological digs called the Riverside Project, led by University of Sheffield. During those digs within the Stonehenge environs, and that's all they've released, they found 6 skulls with probably elongated, but they say were binded to made to look that way. But come on, we know the real deal here. So they haven't released anything about that yet. So we're waiting for what's called an archaeological paper to be released, and hopefully that will be released in around October. There have been other skulls besides those ones found. In about sort of 1750, an antiquarian called Edward Duke, he opened up a barrow, which was a burial mound, in around about the 2500 time frame, if we're to believe that, and we'll challenge that in a moment. But nonetheless, they opened it up and found a very, very large skeleton. So skull rather, and a bone. And they think that when they looked in depth at what size would this person have been, they think it'd been around 8 or 9 feet tall. So, and they took the skull, and again trying to track that down with the British Museum, the local museums, you just led a merry dance. So there's artifacts that have been discovered at Stonehenge that haven't been released to the general public, or researchers such as myself and yourself and others besides. And also what I always like to point out about Stonehenge, Carrie, is what it used to look like, and I'll come to that. But within that last archaeological dig that happened at Stonehenge, led by Geoffrey Wainwright, what they discovered was 2 pieces of carbon. I mean, to the average archaeologist, this is their holy grail. Carbon can detect timescales if we're to believe that system works. But let's just say for one moment it does. One of those grains was 2500 BC, and it fit neatly into their little package of time dates. But the other was 10,000 BC. And the archaeologists, what they do is, instead of using the older date, they use the youngest. So even using their own dating system, Stonehenge can be put way back to the Mesolithic period of 10,000 BC, categorically. So what did it look like? Stonehenge was a colourful place. today we see pictures of it on the internet and they look like grey stones on a windswept Salisbury plain, and indeed they are. But that's after thousands and thousands and thousands of years of erosion and windswept damage, because that's such an exposed place in the British countryside, the Salisbury plain, which incidentally is owned by the MOD, and there are at least 10 military sites surrounding Stonehenge in a circle. Yeah, so that is Stonehenge. We have the equivalent of your Area 51. It's called the Salisbury Plain. There are places on the Salisbury Plain that have beautiful monuments, some of the best monuments in the country, that are on MOD land and have no access to.
Really?
Yeah. So that is our Area 51, and Stonehenge is amid that. Yeah.
Oh, fascinating.
So what Stonehenge used to look like, yeah? The gigantic stones, and there was 30 great large stones called sarsam, and they were highly polished and worked so that they appeared very silver-like. That was the outside circle. So imagine it that the crystalline structure was showing through, so it would glint in the sun and in the moonlight alike. Yeah. Then you would have moved into the inner circle and you'd have come across the blue stones. They come from 170 miles away in the Preseli Mountains. And they're called blue stones because they literally are a beautiful colour blue, like the midnight sky. And they have tiny flexes of feldspar, which are like white crystal, if you will. So when they were highly polished, they looked like a star-spangled midnight sky, very smooth to touch. So much so that put your face against it and it would have felt like velvet. Then you would have moved again into the sanctity of Stonehenge, where there are said to be 5 gigantic trilithons in a horseshoe shape. Again, they were very, very silver, but bejeweled in the centre of Stonehenge was the altar stone, and the altar stone was special. It stood 16 feet high, and its colour was green. It was green sandstone, flexed with garnet. That's a ruby-like colour. So yes, Stonehenge was colourful and it was beautiful. And today, that is long gone.
Fascinating. Okay, and in terms of what they're doing to Stonehenge, and this is true of power places around the planet, they're roping them off. They're not allowing people to touch the stones. They're not allowing people to go close to them at all. You need a special permit to get in with a party, right?
Yeah.
But you've also noted that they're not allowed to touch, even with a permit now. They can't go too close to the stones. Is that correct?
You're right, Karen. If you pay some money to English Heritage, you can have private access. You're right, and you can go in with a group of up to 26 people. Yeah. Now, Stonehenge became really active around about 2010, because of a lunar alignment that preceded 2012. Because Stonehenge has lunar associations, stellar associations, as well as the famous Summer Solstice Sunrise Association. It became active in 2010. And that is literally a few years later. We're heading towards 2012. From that time frame, even on private access, you can't touch the stones. You're denied any interaction with the stones. Why? Because Stonehenge can switch your consciousness on. It can awaken you, and it can allow you to remember that which was, and hopefully will be again.
Fascinating. Well, I must say you're very eloquent when you're speaking, and I want to compliment you on that. So in terms of where this takes us, have you been thinking about, because you're really sort of having your finger on the literal pulse of like groundwaters and what's under the ground. So the link-ups, because I have a person named Keith Hunter, and he talks about military bases being built on these vortex sites, these important ley line intersections, and obviously you've just said that Stonehenge is surrounded by military bases, correct? So it would be utilizing that energy, right? Now the question is, how is it utilizing the energy? And we also, this may relate to the idea that the stones ring like bells, as Michael Tellinger would say. But you also said it's Saturnian. It relates to the planet Saturn. Can you link all that together in some form for me, and explain how you think it might be used by the powers that be?
Yes, I can remember having a fantastic fun day with the UFO hunters at Stonehenge, yeah? And we went on the inside and we kind of looked at the vortex, and just like you said, Keith Hunt, wasn't it you said? Hunter, excuse me, Keith Hunter. And he noted these correlations, and he's right, it happens worldwide. And just a mile and a half away from Stonehenge you have what's called Lark Hill. And Lark Hill is the first military establishment. Now, there's a long lost monument in the Stonehenge environs that archaeologists don't talk about because it's so unusual that they would rather not talk about it. But hey, that's what attracts me. So now, imagine standing in front of Stonehenge, predating Stonehenge by 1,000 years, Orthodox time date, that there was a monument 2 miles long. Well, if you're being pernickety, 1.75 miles long. It was made of gigantic chalk blocks, creating a rectangular enclosure with the walls some 10 feet high and with no entrance. Yeah, no entrance whatsoever. This wasn't meant for mankind. Yeah. The archaeologists told me when I was studying these monuments with Wessex Archaeology, but they're for death rites, Maria. So how do I enter that? Do I slide down a 10-foot bank and then scrabble back up? That is a nonsense. It's a label that has been labelled from the King's Chamber to the burial mounds at Stonehenge. You're nodding away, you know all of this. So, what is going on in that monument? Back in the 90s, and my family have been studying this since about the 1990s, in the near centre of the Cursus monument, and that's what that monument is called, that gigantic 2-mile monument called the Cursus, recorded by antiquarians from the 17th century onward. It releases massive amounts of gamma radiation. Yeah. The gamma radiation is quite destructive to your system. We all know that. But could our ancient ancestors have been prehistoric physicists, able to alchemically transmute that type of energy? Whatever is happening, round about the times of the equinoxes, and by the way, nobody's allowed into Stonehenge at that time, private party or not, you cannot enter that. Round about that time, that's when you have, inexplicably, these releases of gamma radiation. What I think the military and powers that be, these shadow government, the Illuminati, call them what you will, I think that they have a kind of missing link that maybe some researchers don't, and they can tap into these energy systems, because it has been reported by military personnel that have spoken to me personally that one thing Stonehenge does, it alters time. So, 2 officers told me that they experienced time lapses around Stonehenge on the ley line that runs very close to that ancient Cursus monument. So, I would suggest that the military can start to manipulate time, yeah, and maybe send people ahead of time or behind time. Because, like I said, these are trained officers that have spoken to me, and their stories are, well, we would say believable. The general public might say unbelievable. So I think it can create time warp Stonehenge. That's why it is surrounded by military attention. Portendown is nearby, and that's a biological centre which can be switched off in the general public just like that. They have massive barriers coming down. A colleague of mine saw a UFO flying into it, so we know that there's a kind of alien military pact on the Salisbury Plain upon which the Stonehenge is sited. It's multi-layered, the use of Stonehenge, but bet your bottom dollar, categorically, the military know this and they utilise Stonehenge for their own time experiments.
I'm just still interested in this Saturn link-up with the Stonehenge because it's kind of an unexpected link-up in a sense. Now I can tell you that I've been told there's a direct ley line that connects the Great Pyramid to Stonehenge. Also going through what is called Dimona in Israel, where they have a military base that is also a time travel device, apparently is housed. So Stonehenge is, if I remember correctly, is considered the female, and the Great Pyramid is the male. And so that direct link up is very substantial and very important. And you may know that people are sent, people like us, what you call sensitives, earth sensitives, however you want to term it, what we can do is transmit energies through our bodies, and I'm sure you're one because you wouldn't be a dowser otherwise. So we are actually sent by sort of positive unseen forces, if you want to call it that, to these places in a numerological pattern. This is something I've observed, and it's something that's happened to me. In other words, I'll go visit the Great Pyramid, and there'll be some reason why I'm sent suddenly, and I go to Stonehenge. And it's not a plan that I have in my head beforehand. It simply happens. And it's just happening again here, because here I just went to Avebury yesterday. So here I am going to another power place. And no doubt I'm going to end up in another power place that I don't even know what it's going to be. Linking them up, me being sort of a carrier, if you will. And this kind of thing is going on. There's a transmutation of energy. But when you say Stonehenge is linked to Saturn, do you take it any further? Do you know why or what that means?
Well, the idea that Stonehenge is linked to Saturn came from an antiquarian called the Reverend Edward Duke. He was a Mason, and he was privy to occult libraries, and he got a diagram of the Avebury and Stonehenge environs, all of which linked to certain planets. So you had Saturn equating to Stonehenge, Avebury, the sun and the moon, the Temple of Venus north of Avebury, and so on and so forth. And modern henge, a gigantic super henge, no longer exists, was Mars. Den means settlement, Mars, the settlement of Mars. So you have the solar system depicted in the landscape. Now, Saturn on one level represents the Lord of Time, the Lord of Karma. It takes roughly 30 years for Saturn to go around the zodiac belt, and astrologers term, your Saturn return will happen about 29, 30, and every 29 years after that. Well, there's 30 standing stones going around Stonehenge, equating to Saturn's orbital path, so to speak. And I think, again, the Stonehenge especially links to time. So that is why Saturn is associated to it. And also the ley that runs through Stonehenge, and then you could have seen it at one time as a dugout track, because leys in this country weren't necessarily just a line drawn on a bit of paper. They were indented into the landscape like this, so that when a star or the sun or the moon aligned to it, it would be a shaft of light going through the earth, imbuing it with solar energy, stellar energy, and moon energy, lunar energy rather. So yes, I think it's associated intimately with time.
Okay, well that would lend itself to being a time travel device in essence.
Yes.
A portal where a very substantial portal, larger than many that we probably, because you, in a sense, if you're going to mark a portal, ancient beings of any kind, they would, using such gigantic stones to mark that particular portal is quite unusual.
Yes, again, where I've studied Stonehenge for so long, and my next book's going to be, about Stonehenge, I suddenly realised, Kerry, that what you said is not how the ancients saw Stonehenge. They'd actually, when you're travelling down the road now, you see all these stones, don't you? Of course you do. But Stonehenge was surrounded by a gigantic bank, It blocked off public view, for want of a better expression. So you would have just seen the tips of the very top stones. You wouldn't know what was going on the inside of Stonehenge. It was a secretive place, even at the time of our ancestors, with one small opening with 3 stones in front of it, so you couldn't even look in what's happening in Stonehenge. Unless you were invited, well, you don't know what's going on. That is the Stonehenge of our ancestors.
Yes, but that doesn't change what it would be used for. In other words, in the sense that I was talking, I actually could envision it as surrounded by forest as well, back in those days.
Well, Stonehenge, that was what used to be thought as the case, is surrounded, but snails make wonderful archaeologists, and you have snails that like woodland environments and dry land, grass environments, and the archaeological studies coming out of the Riverside Project realised that it was all cleared for miles around, so it wasn't surrounded by trees or forests.
Even back in
the Neolithic.
As long ago, really.
Yes.
Okay, that's interesting. I wonder if that's. But when you say cleared, do you mean they cleared the forest manually?
They cleared the forests, yes.
Before they built it, or while they built it?
Before they built it.
Yeah.
I mean, we must remember as well, there are monuments long gone that predate Stonehenge by thousands of years. We're spoon-fed that the Mesolithic people, and by that I mean 8,000 BC to 4,000 BC, we are spoon-fed that they were hunter-gatherers, yeah? And they had these spears and off they went, you know, and it's just an injustice to our forefathers,
yes.
because they have recently found a substantial town, a Mesolithic town just outside of Stonehenge. So that's again pushing the timeline back to nearly 10,000 years. And this was occupied, you know, century after century after century. So this was a thriving town near Stonehenge, at about a mile down the road actually. And the flints that they were found, and don't for 1 minute think flint is an inferior tool to metal. It is not. It is very, very sharp. And they found a deposit of flints, like they call it ritual deposit, but it could have been just, you know, placed into the earth for whatever reasons. But they were so razor sharp still that when the archaeologists tried to get them out of the ground, they cut themselves, because that dated that entire monument. They're called lithics, little bits of flints that were made into knives. So again, we need to see our ancient ancestors as living in towns outside of Stonehenge, yeah, yes. 10,000 years ago. They were not hunter-gatherers.
Very good. Okay, just briefly, we did talk about Malta, and you have gone there as a dowser, and you were saying that you seem to have tapped into something I tapped into, which is that it was a sacred site. Actually, it was a retreat, and the entire island was this sort of solitary a haven for people to go and meditate and do sort of what do you call that? You know, a sojourn, like almost a religious or a spiritual sojourn in a place, and it's riddled with tunnels, and they call it catacombed, honeycombed in a sense, underneath all of the ancient sites there. So I'm wondering, what did you experience as a dowser on Malta? Because I have been talking a lot about Malta, and it seems to be an incredible energy place.
You're right, it is an incredible energy place. But let's take away all of the monuments out of Malta for one moment. The land itself is highly energized. It has every single type of earth energy you are ever going to experience in the world in Malta. So it's like a university for a dowser to learn by. Not only that, they seem to resonate a really high frequency, because you can get earth energy frequencies. Some can be quite low, some can be medium. At Malta, they're really high. I think some of the kind of tunnel systems, or let's say the underground part of Malta, is really tuning in to the energies of the earth itself. And when we think about it, you know, the earth is ancient sites are associated with underground water. Water has memory, doesn't it? Every homeopathic person will tell you that. Well, the Earth's waters as well, I think they form the Earth's Akashic records. Yeah, they record everything that was, because time's not linear. Everything that will be. So I think when you're in that kind of deep frequency of a tunnel or way down in the ground, then you can really relate to these different frequencies and tap into the Earth's Akashic records and the planetary system. I'm not talking about my personal life here, my personal past lives. I'm talking about planetary past lives. The land of Malta is very, very sacred. Some of the most sacred, I believe, in the world. And you're right, and I think the ancient peoples recognize this, and so they utilize that for places to go, to learn, to tap into the planetary consciousness that we call Gaia now, and to understand their spiritual purpose and many other things besides.
Right, and I have to say that just, as part of this, that the Vatican and the Knights of Malta seem to be very tuned into this. They seem to know that this is the case on Malta. This is why they put their base there, and this is why they sort of safeguard it. And it's been somewhat hidden from the world. It seems that Malta and Maltese history has been kept sort of in the dark a lot from the eyes of the world, and I think that's going to change, hopefully as a result of people like you and myself and other people that are researchers, like Hubert Zietemeyer, who specializes in Malta and its history. And I think it is a power place, a very important power place on the planet. And so thank you, because that's very helpful to sort of get that from a dowser, somebody who really taps into those ancient waters. I guess one last question in terms of the world situation, and you were talking about, we know we have this electromagnetic smog around us. Certainly the groundwater is being affected, just like everything else. That seems logical. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. I think e-smog, electromagnetic smog, is going to be something we as a community and people will have to really address in the future, because it is a pollutant. Now, if I could see e-smog and I could see it as black smoke, would I breathe it in? Of course I wouldn't, yeah? But it's around me and it's invisible, so it kind of doesn't matter because I can't see it. But the standing stones of ancient sites worldwide were designed to transmit and receive, like I said earlier, like a semiconductor, and they will transmit Wi-Fi signals. And David Webb, an engineer from Hampshire, discovered at the Rollright Ring in Oxfordshire that they were indeed transmitting man-made signals. So I think we ought to wake up to the dangers of Wi-Fi, not just for our own physical bodies, but for the ancient past.
Very important. All right. Well, thank you very much. This has been fascinating, and I'd love to, like I said, have you as a guest on my radio show, and we'll talk more about your work. And do you have a website that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks. Yes, it's called www.theaveburyexperience.co.uk. So it's theaveburyexperience.co.uk.
Okay, and just one last question. Do you happen to live near Avebury or one of these kind of ley line type places?
Oh, absolutely. I'm so in love with Avebury and Stonehenge, Kerry. I live here in Marlborough. I couldn't live anywhere else. This is my spiritual home. It's my motherland. Transmit in a particular manner, and it's very exciting how they transmit, because just like we have 7 chakras, and I know you spoke about your Kundalini awakening at the conference, standing stones have 7 energy points. 2 are below the ground and 5 are above, and they too transmit and awaken energy points within the stones, and they transmit in a wireless network, and they can transmit for mile after mile across the ceremonial landscape. And with a chap called Rodney Hale, I proved with his help that these energy points that are dowsable, in fact some people could pick them up on their hands, and I'm sure that you could feel the energies coming out of the stones with your hands, Carrie. And what Rodney did, he rigged up some equipment to see if he could record the energy points. And what he did, he found that they were actually transmitting electromagnetic energy at 18 hertz in frequency. Now you hear at 20. What if our ancient ancestors could literally hear that just a place called Valley Forge? So I spent some time in America, and my late father fell in love with Serpent Mound, Cahokia, and Newark, and these kind of power places in America. Because America has some of the largest ancient sites in the world. I mean, Newark is the largest henge in the world. Yeah, it's twice the size of Avebury-Henge. It was phenomenal. And Serpent Mound is unique in its own respect as well. So I've doused in America, I've doused in Brittany, France, Turkey, Italy, Sicily, Malta. So I've kind of doused quite a few places in Europe, and they all seem to have similar design canons. And by design canon, I mean the earth energies upon which they're sited. One pattern that prevails throughout the ancient world is a spiral pattern. It's called a geospiral, and any water diviner that is professional would recognize that this spiral pattern is quite used that bit better at 18 hertz, and literally heard the sounds the stones were being emitting. And these sounds, imagine them like kind of straight laser beams going from one stone to the next, to the next, to the next. So inside of a stone circle you have all of the stones pushing out these energy beams and communicating to one another. And then one particular band on these kind of 7 levels of energy, if you like, going up a stone, one of the higher bands transmits to the next stone circle, 18 hertz frequency. So really the whole of the ancient landscape is not separated, it's connected.
Right, very, very interesting. Well, in terms of your work, have you gone around only to England, or have you gone around the world?
I've gone to many places around the world. I mean, from the age of about 13 to 16, I was actually living in America, in Pennsylvania.
And how you got into this area?
Yeah, sure. I got into dowsing and water divining from a very young age because my late father was considered one of the UK's Master Dowsers, and he inherited a lot of papers from other Master Dowsers, and over the past, I suppose, 25 years or more now, we've been looking into the design canons of ancient sites and specialising on ley lines and how they flow through the ritual landscape. So my understanding of ancient sites is looking through the energy patterns. Why is Avebury set where it is? Why is Stonehenge located where it is? And we look to those patterns, to the geological influences, and literally what is embedded in the ground there. And sometimes, like I mentioned in my presentation, it is a particular type of water, which I'll touch on in a moment. And when ancient standing stones are literally plugged into grids, or plugged into ley lines, or plugged into an energy system, they begin to
from Project Camelot, and I'm here with Maria Wheatley, and we're going to get a short interview here. This has been a very active conference, jam-packed every moment, and we haven't had a lot of time. I wasn't able to sit in on her presentation, and I know that I got at the very tail end, and so I know she talked about water, and she seems to have quite a background in ley lines, etc., and I think it's very important information. So wanted to try to catch you here. So if you could give us your background.